Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Ethan, and today I'm going to show you how to create a super simple camera rig that will immediately up the quality and visual interest of your renders in Blender. I'll also go over some additional things that you can do, which make the rig a bit more complex, but end up providing a ton of flexibility so you can be really creative while you're using it. This camera setup is something I've been perfecting over the last several years, and I honestly use it all the time in my professional client work. All right, that's all you need to know. Let's get into Blender. Okay, so here I am in Blender 3.4, and I just finished modeling and texturing this chair that you see here. So let's say I want to create a simple animation to show off my work. One thing I could do is simply keyframe the location and rotation values of my camera. I could set keyframes here at the beginning like so, and then I could go all the way to the end of my timeline, adjust those location and rotation values, create new keyframes, and then I would have a very simple animation ready to go, just like you see here. The problem is that doing things this way won't always produce great results, and you can also waste a lot of time adjusting all these different values for a pretty subpar result. What I like to do instead is bring in a circle and then use what's called an object constraint, which will basically track my camera to the edge of that circle and give me a sort of grand sweeping motion. So let's do that now. The first thing I'll do is hit Shift A on my keyboard, and then I will go down to where it says curve, and then I will add a circle to my scene. I'll take a second or two just to roughly scale the circle to the size that I want, and I think this is looking pretty good. The circle right now is sitting a bit low as well, so I'll just reposition it a bit, like so. Cool. Now, like I was saying, I'm going to have the camera track along the edge of this circle. The way that I like to start this process is by first zeroing out all the location and rotation values for my camera. So one way to think about this is that the circle is basically going to be telling the camera where to go. So any additional information here is just going to confuse Blender. Okay, so after you zero out those values, you should see the camera like this, here in the center of the scene, pointing downwards. Excellent. Next, I'll make sure that the camera is still selected, and then I'll go over here to the Object Constraints tab. And in this tab, I'll click to open this menu that says Add Object Constraint, and then I will click on Follow Path. You will see that that did absolutely nothing, and that's because for the constraint to really have an effect, we have to first designate a target. So on the very top where it says target, I'll click that eyedropper icon there, and then I will simply click on the circle that we brought into the scene a minute ago. Now the circle is designated as the target, and the camera has been repositioned so it's sitting right there on the edge of the circle. Now the camera is still pointing down, and we don't want that, so we're going to adjust some more settings. First, we will go to the Object Properties tab for a second, and I'm going to change the rotation X value from 0 to 90. And now if I hop into the camera view by hitting 0 on the number pad, you can see that the camera is now facing our subject, which is good. I'll go ahead and exit out of camera view and go back to the Constraints tab here. And back in this tab, the next setting that we are going to adjust is the offset value. If I start playing with this value, you'll see this moves the camera along the circle, but the orientation is way off. But we can fix this easily by first ticking the box here that says Follow Curve, and then after that, we'll also change the forward axis from Y to -X. And now you see if I adjust the offset value, we have a really nice, very basic camera rig. I could set my offset value like this and insert some keyframes, and then go to the end of my timeline, adjust the offset value again, insert some more keyframes, and just like that, we have an animation. All right, so that's great, and you could stop there, but I'm gonna keep building out this rig and add some additional controls. The first thing I'll do is hit Shift A to add, and then I'm going to go down to where it says empty, and then I will add a sphere empty. If you've never used an empty before, they're definitely worth learning about. There are truly endless ways to use empties in Blender. For this camera rig though, we are going to use the empty as a target, just like we used that circle a bit earlier. First, let me scale down the empty just a bit. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so I will make sure my camera is selected, and then I will go back to the Object Constraints tab here on the right. And again, I'm going to hit the Add Object Constraint, and this time I will click where it says Damped Track. And very similar to the Follow Path constraint, I can click on the eyedropper icon and then use it to select the empty in my scene and designate that as a target. Now you'll see, just like before, we need to adjust these settings to get the orientation of the camera correct. So where it says track axis, I will actually change the axis from Y to -Z. And so now if I go into camera view and just start moving this empty around, that will give you a good idea of what we have going on here. We have total control of where the camera is facing while still maintaining that awesome circular motion around the subject. And this gives us so much flexibility. For instance, if I take our camera track circle and move it upwards, and then use the empty to sort of recenter our subject, you can see I get this bird's eye view sort of look. But if I take our camera track circle and bring it down, we get more of a hero shot of our subject. Also, if I have that circle selected, I can simply hit S on my keyboard to scale the circle up or down, like so. The scale of the circle, like many other things with this rig, can be keyframed. So if I take a second to set up some scale keyframes for the circle at the start of the timeline, and then jump to the end of my timeline and make the circle a bit larger, and then set some new keyframes, you'll get an animation that looks like this. By the way, if you make sure your mouse is hovering over the timeline at the bottom, you can hit Shift-E on your keyboard and then select Linear Extrapolation. I'd like to do this for product shots and lots of other stuff in Blender. I just think it looks a lot nicer than the default. Okay, so another thing I love about this rig is that it works super well for all different kinds of subjects. I've been using this chair as an example so far, but let's change things up. Let's hide the chair and bring in these orange models from a recent project. The first thing I can do is scale down that empty and then adjust its position, which will basically recenter my subject in the frame. Another thing I would do here is make sure my camera is selected and then go to my camera properties tab here on the right. And here in this tab, I can adjust the camera's focal length. So it looks like the default setting is a 50mm focal length. Let's change that to 100mm. And just like before, we can also adjust the position of the circle that the camera is tracked to, and also the empty, to get all kinds of different looks. Okay, the last thing I want to share is how I add a background to these types of renders. You can see that so far we've been animating on this cylinder shape, which works really nicely as a floor, but if you want to get that nice photo studio backdrop look, this is how I do it. First, I make sure the offset value of my camera is 0. If I hit 7 on my number pad and go into the top view, you'll see my camera is facing exactly in this direction. So once I confirm that, I simply add a plane, and then I'll go ahead and rotate the plane 90 degrees so it's facing the camera, just like this. And then I'll just move it back, and I'll scale it up. So if I go into my camera view, I can see the plane is filling up the frame nicely. That looks good. I'll take a second to copy the material of my floor, and then I'll create a new material for this background plane and paste the material. Now, if I start adjusting the offset value of my camera in the Constraints tab, you can see the plane is just sitting there. It's not really a part of this rig. To make it a part of the rig that moves seamlessly with everything else, we are actually going to parent it to the camera. To do this, we can start by hitting Alt-A on the keyboard to make sure that nothing is selected. Then I'll select the plane, and then after selecting the plane, I'll select the camera. I'm being really detailed here because the order that you select in is actually really important. So again, we'll select the plane and then we'll select the camera, and then I'll hit Control-P on my keyboard, which will bring up this parent menu. And then I'm going to select the first option that just says Object. Perfect. So now if I play with the offset value here, you can see the plane is going to stay positioned exactly where we want it relative to the camera. And then to create that sort of seamless fall off in the background, I actually like to adjust the depth of field. So we can do this by selecting our camera and going into the camera properties tab once again. I'll scroll down to where it says depth of field and I will tick that box. And just like with the 2 constraints that we used before, I'll click on the eyedropper icon and then use the eyedropper to designate a target. I'm going to select the sphere empty from our rig as the target and then bring the f-stop down from 2.8 to, let's say, 2. You can go lower. It really depends on what sort of lighting you have going on in your scene and what sort of look you're going for. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. That was today's video, and if you got something out of it, if you want to like or subscribe, that really helps out, so I'd appreciate it. I also wanted to mention that I do have a Patreon. Over there, I offer asset packs, project files from the tutorials, things like that, so I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check that out. Otherwise, yeah, that's pretty much it. Take care. I'll see you in the next one.